What on earth is shutter speed, and how will it help make your footage look more cinematic? What is going on, guys? Andrew Raff here, and today we are in the last part of our three-part series of the exposure triangle, and to finish it off, we are talking about shutter speed. But before we start, if you haven't seen the ISO or Aperture videos, I'll put links below so you can check them out because they all link together. So as always, let's figure out exactly what shutter speed does so you can understand a whole lot better. So shutter speed is the amount of time that your sensor is exposed to light. So by changing our shutter speed, we can either increase the amount of light that hits the sensor or decrease it depending on what the number we choose. So one of the most common shutter speeds you probably would have heard is 1/50 or 1/100, which basically means 1/50th of a second and 1/100th of a second. And the easiest way to understand this is to think how your DSLR works when it takes a photo. So if you set your exposure to 1 second, say, when you take a photo, what's gonna happen is your shutter's gonna open, stay open for 1 second, and then close. So basically says the amount of time that your image has to expose is 1 second. Another example is, say you had 1/250th of a second. Basically means that once the shutter opens, 1/250th of a second will pass before it closes again, which is very, very quick. But because the shutter also works as almost like a gate for light to enter onto your sensor, it also affects the exposure. So a 1 second exposure would obviously let a lot more light in to hit the sensor before the shutter closes than say 1/250th of a second, which would only let the tiniest amount of light in. So obviously if we want less light to hit our sensor, we want it to be quicker. So say 1/250th of a second. But if we want more light to hit our sensor, we want it to be longer, like say a second. The other thing shutter speed also controls is motion blur. Now this one is a little bit tricky to figure out, but I'll try to break it down so you can understand it perfectly. So basically when your shutter's open, it's exposing your sensor to light that's coming in through the lens. And the whole time the sensor's open, it's basically trying to build the image as it's seeing it. So think about if we're shooting a scene at nighttime. And basically what we want to do is we want to capture a car coming past. We want to freeze the motion. What we're going to have to do is we're going to have to figure out how to capture that car moving past so we're only capturing a section of its drive-by. So as the car's driving past, we only want to capture it here, but because it's going to keep moving, if we try to do a long exposure, so say it comes past and we start it here, it's going to keep capturing information as it goes across to say here, and then you're going to get this big blurry line because it's trying to get data the whole time the sensor's open. But what we can do is if we choose a fast shutter speed, and what we can do is as the car is driving past, we can just capture that moment in time where it's in the middle, and then it will just keep driving off. Now in video, generally you can't go below 1 over your frame rate, and basically the reason that is because say if you're shooting at 25 frames a second and your shutter speed is 1/25th, it basically means that there's 25 1/25th exposures to make up that full second, which means that each individual frame has its own exposure. But say if you're shooting at 25 frames a second and you drop your shutter speed down to say 1/5 of a second, each exposure that your camera takes is going to take 1/5 of a second, which means that every 5 frames is going to be just one single exposure. Each exposure is going to take 1/5 of a second, which means that you can only fit in 5 exposures, which means that you're only actually shooting at 5 frames a second. All right. So a lot of info coming in. It is quite confusing, but go back, watch it, and I'm sure you'll understand it. Now, general thumb is that when you're shooting video, you want your shutter speed to be double your frame rate. So we're shooting at 25 frames a second, you want shutter speed to be 1/50th of a second. And the reason for this is that that is basically as close as we can get to what our eyes actually see in real life. However, you do want to remember that when you lower your shutter speed, you're going to introduce more motion blur into your image. So if motion blur is not what you want in your image, then you might want to bump that up a little bit more. So if you're shooting at 25 frames a second, you might want to shoot at 1/100th of a second or 1/200th of a second. You also find that when you're trying to bring your aperture really low to get that blurry background in broad daylight, your shutter speed is probably going to be the only thing that you can actually adjust once your ISO goes all the way down. Now for me, I always have my shutter 2 to 1 of what my frame rate's going to be. So if I'm shooting at 25 frames a second, I'll always shoot at 1/50th of a second. And if I'm shooting at 50 frames a second, I'll always shoot at 1/100th of a second. The reason that is because it gives me the perfect amount of motion blur and gives me that cinematic look. But the thing I see time and time again is that people will compromise exposure just to get their settings into that cinematic space. So enough jargon, let's go into how you can actually use shutter speed practically in real world situations. So let's say we're shooting a really, really low establishing shot. As we're whizzing past the ground, what we want to see is we want to see a nice amount of motion blur coming towards the camera so we can see kind of the speed that we're traveling along at. So if we set our shutter speed too high, we're going to lose that motion blur and it's going to be really choppy. So as you can see in this first shot, our shutter speed is too high and there's not enough motion blur. But once we change our shutter speed, we can actually feel the motion and the speed of the camera going along the ground. So you're probably asking yourself then, why on earth do we want to up our shutter speed when it's just going to reduce the amount of motion blur? And the reason for this is that in some situations, you will literally have no other option but to increase your shutter speed to get a correct exposure. Because you have to remember that shutter speed is part of the exposure triangle. So if your ISO and aperture are fixed and you don't want to change them, the only thing you can do to increase or decrease your exposure is change your shutter speed. And the last example is a little hack that I use sometimes with your shutter speed to basically get stabler footage. So we know that a higher shutter speed will reduce motion blur, which is good in situations where you want to do post-stabilization. So this won't really work for shots where there's big long movements, but it will work for shots where there's just a little bit of movement or if you're just staying still. By upping the shutter speed and reducing the amount of motion blur, it means that there's more data for the computer to analyze when you're trying to do post-stabilization, which will actually result in a smoother stabilization and you get less of that jello effect. And to finish it off, guys, remember that shutter speed is part of the exposure triangle. So if you change shutter speed, you're gonna have to compensate it with something else if you want your exposure to stay the same. So if you like this video, please give us a thumbs up and consider subscribing for more videos and tutorials like this. And leave a comment below if you got something out of this or if there's any tutorials you want to see in the future. And as always, guys, happy videoing and I'll see you soon.